For those of you that can remember back to April 2013, the fields were pretty bare. We'd had a pretty cold February, March time. The fields were quite bare at the beginning of April. So all of the first cut silage made during May only had 6 to 7 weeks growth. So it was very young grass, very good quality. In 2014, the situation was very different in that grass started growing in Christmas time, never really stopped, and grew consistently all the way through the winter and into the early spring. So by the time the grass was ready for cutting at the beginning of May, it had already been growing for 4 to 5 months. So there was some quite mature grass there at that stage. Then that was followed by a wet start to May, so we were delayed for another fortnight before anything was cut. So the consequence is the grass silage this year, on first cuts in particular, the quality is nowhere near as good as last year, and for some of you it will be quite disappointing when you open up the clamps and start feeding it. The analysis we're actually seeing on first cuts is quite significantly below last year. All the analyses we do go through Frank Wright or Trow Nutrition now, one of the largest silage analysis labs in the country. And if we look at their national figures, last year their first cut silages averaged 11 ME. And this year, up to the end of September, all of the first cut silages analysed across the whole country only come out at 10.5 ME. Now, that's quite a big difference, because for those of you that aren't particularly familiar with ME values in silages, very low quality silage would be 9.5, and the very best is 11.5. So to get a half a megajoule difference on a range of what would normally only be 2 megajoules is very significant. Second cuts this year are slightly better than first cuts, but not very much. The national fit picture suggests 10.6 ME, but there's probably a lot more variation on that. Certainly what we're seeing at farm level is some of the second cut silage, or a lot of the second cut silage, are significantly better than first cut. Those farms where it was cut at 5 to 6 week intervals, which is what we need to be doing for quality silage, a lot of those are actually making the 11 ME, similar to the first cut we had last year. So that's the national picture. In terms of maize silage, I suspect a lot of you are growing maize silage for your beef as well, for the finishing cattle. I was concerned 3 or 4 weeks ago that the quality of that might actually be quite poor, because we've seen some very, very tall crops coming off, 20-ton crops and even some 25-ton crops in some areas on good soils, but only normal-sized cobs. So I was concerned that the starch might be diluted too much. But on the first 40 or 50 samples we've been through, the analysis is coming out incredibly good. The digestibility of the fibre element of the maize silage is very high this year. A lot of the crops have been cut a bit green but still dry. And the starch contents are coming out at 30% on pretty well every sample we've seen. So maize silage is very good quality. The grass silage leaving a bit to be desired this year. Right, then moving on to supplements. One of the factors you will, if you have your silage analysed, which is absolutely essential you do that this year, but one of the factors you'll see on the analysis is NDF, nutrient-detergent fibre. Now, that on the grass silage is coming out quite high this year and quite low on the maize. But if you are feeding a grass silage-based system for growing or finishing cattle, it's important that you actually avoid feeds which are high NDF as your supplement. Products such as brewer's grains are very high in NDF, sugar beet pulp, soya hulls, palm kernel meal, all of those products are very high in NDF. Now, the cattle have only got a specific appetite, and NDF is part of that appetite. They can only eat around about 1.2% of their body weight as this NDF, this fibre. So if we've got a high fibre silage, it's important we balance that with a low fibre, low NDF concentrate. We'll come on to the NDFs and the various concentrates a bit later on. The other area we need to think about is what silage intakes we're likely to achieve on the animals this year with the quality of silages we've got. And probably the best way of looking at silage intakes is to relate it to body weight. If we've got a very poor quality silage, the animals will only eat about 1.8% of their body weight. So for a 400 kilo animal, that comes out at 7.2 kilograms of silage dry matter. But if that's an 11 ME silage with a lower fibre level, digested more quickly in the rumen, they will eat 2.5% of their body weight. So on a 400 kilo animal, that could be 10 kilograms of silage dry matter. So we're looking at a difference in silage dry matter intakes between poor quality silage and good quality silage of 7.2 versus 10 kilograms of dry matter. Now, if we feed no supplements for that, and it's just that straight silage you were feeding to a 400 kilogram animal, you could expect a live weight gain of around about half a kilogram on the poor quality silage, but as much as 1.2 kilograms on the good quality silage. Obviously a significant saving in quality there if we can achieve that high quality silage. With regard to protein levels, I'm not going to say very much about that today because protein isn't really the issue this winter. On the growing diets, we need to be aiming at around about 15% in the overall diet. So that's not on the concentrate part of it, that's in the overall diet. But for the finishing cattle, around about 12% would normally be adequate to achieve what we need. Cereals then. I expect some of you are cereal growers as well, very depressed with the prices, but for beef producers who aren't growing their own cereals, this is looking very attractive this year. Here in the southwest at the moment, we've had wheat coming in the last few weeks at about £100 a tonne. Oats are coming in less than that, barley around about £95 a tonne. So very cheap source of energy out there this year. And the nice thing about that is the cereals are very low in NDF, so they're ideal to balance these poor quality silages we're talking about. Now, one thing we need to consider is processing these cereals. I suspect a lot of you are quite used to processing cereals and you have your own facilities on your own farms. But for those of you that have been used to feeding bought-in dairy cake or bought-in beef nuts for feeding the beef, this is a chance now to actually change away from that and buy in straight cereals if you haven't got your own and get them processed on the farm. Now, with the on-farm processing, with products like or grains like barley and wheat, they will need processing on the farm. But if you buy oats, they don't necessarily need processing. The grain size on the oats does that mean that cattle up to around about 250, 300 kilos live weight can digest whole oats. Some of you have probably fed whole oats to sheep in the past, and we can certainly do that to calves and anything up to 250 kilos. There may be a small amount of wastage, but if we think about the processing cost, that could cost anything between sort of 8 and 17, 20 pound a tonne. And so even if we get a small amount running through, if the processing cost is 15 pound a tonne, we could afford to waste 15% of the oats going straight through and still break even. So I'd be very tempted if you are feeding oats to feed them whole to the younger stock. There's no need to roll them or process them in any way. In terms of processing cereals on your own farm, there are mobile mill mix companies out there which will come and process them for you, but they tend to be fairly expensive, particularly when cereals are now so cheap, unless you're having a large quantity done. So don't necessarily just use your local person that you've used in the past. On the notes that will be available to you after this call, I have put in a website there for the National Association of Agricultural Contractors, and there is a good section in there on home mixing contractors, which will include farmers with crimpers as well, which can actually just come and do a straight roll for you on the farm. And those costs can vary quite widely from sort of £8 a tonne to £15 a tonne, depending on how much you want processed. Right, okay. Let's look at other feeds then, and what other feeds we should actually be using. Cereals is obviously the main one to concentrate on this year. If you've got silage, which is 14 or 15% protein, then straight cereals on the road would be quite adequate as a supplement. For growing cattle, if you've got the average quality size, you might be putting in 1 kilogram of concentrates to gain best part of a kilo a day. Finishing cattle with just grass silage, you may need to be going up to 4 or 5 kilograms of cereals. But if the silage proteins are lower, or you're actually feeding maize silage or a low protein whole crop to the cattle as well, then some additional protein will be needed. And looking at the range of products which are actually available at the moment, it's important that we compare them on a pence per unit of energy and protein on a dry matter basis. The first correction really is the dry matter. There's no point in trying to compare, say, Trafford Gold or wet distillers or brewers' grains with barley or rape when there's a difference in dry matter. So you need to convert them all back to the dry matter basis first, and ideally then also make the adjustment for energy and protein. Now, there are some of them in the table that will be available to you in the notes afterwards. But just to run through a few of them, in some areas I know some of you might be tempted to use bread. Bread is available quite easily in some areas. But if we the moisture content of that, with wheat costing £120 a tonne after processing, ready to feed on the farm, the fed would only be worth around about £85 a tonne. If we look at products like crimped maize, there will be a lot of crimped maize grain available this year, which is maize that's been combined and just the grain is processed and stored on farm. This is easily available to buy through the trade, but allowing for the fact that it's only going to be 65% dry matter, it does mean it's worth significantly less than the price of dry cereals. And at the moment, with wheat at £120 a tonne, the crimped maize would be worth around about £83, £84 a tonne. There is more wastage as well with these moist feeds, so you probably only need to be paying £80 a tonne for it to be on a break even with rolling dry grain. In terms of the levels of concentrates we feed this winter, a lot of you will have plenty of silage in the clan. The tendency then is to actually say, I don't want to put too much concentrates with this because I've got plenty of silage. That won't give you the live weight gains you're looking for, and it's no good thinking that actually silage is cheap, because if we look at the cost of growing silage and include a rental equivalent on that land as well that's growing the silage, and reseeding every 3 to 5 years to get good production off of it, that grass silage is still going to be costing you around about £80 a tonne of dry matter. And oats would be costing you about £100 a tonne of dry matter, and barley, say, £105 a tonne of dry matter. So the difference in cost of dry matter between the various crops is actually not very great. So it is a year for not necessarily feeding all the silage you've got, carry it over to another year, but don't be afraid to feed the concentrates. We are going to be looking at feeding quite high levels of concentrates this year to get the performance. Okay, Chris, I think that's probably as much as I need to do at the moment.
Thanks very much, Pete. You've kept very well to time. So this is the odd bit where I'm sure lots of people have burst in with questions and you can't speak because you're all muted. Just to explain again, we've muted everybody so that there's no background noise to interfere with the call. So if you have a question for Pete, you can email us at brpconf, that's CONF, at eblex.ahdb.org.uk. Pete, I've got a few questions that have come in. You mentioned the cost of barley. I think you were looking at 95, where I was sort of estimating perhaps £100. So would you suggest feeding it with maize silage to increase growth rates? And is there an upper limit for cereal inclusion with maize silage diets in finishing rations?
Right, yeah. Yes, I certainly would advise topping up maize with extra energy. We do get an increase in performance. Typically, if we were to put just maize silage into a finishing animal, we may achieve live weight gains, topping up with a bit of protein. We may get live weight gains of 1.2 kilos. But if we were to supplement that with an additional 2.5 kilograms of barley, we would get those weight gains up to 1.5 kilos. So it is well worth supplementing with additional cereals on top of maize silage. With regard to the total amount of cereals we can feed alongside maize silage, there isn't actually really any limit, because if we look at the extremes of cattle finishing now, it could be a silage-based diet, or it could be an intensive cereal beef diet, which is on all cereals. So don't be afraid to keep pushing the cereal levels up. There's no safe limit. One thing I should have mentioned perhaps is limestone flour. Some of you have heard me talk about this before. But in terms of neutralizing acidity in the gut and getting more efficient digestion, 100 grams per head of limestone flour in all the finishing diets does actually take the edge off any acidity and dramatically improve live weight gains.
Great, thank you. So I've got an email from Pete here, another Pete. He's looking at oat straw. I'm considering feeding oat straw together with brewer's grains and possibly some molasses. To save costs and keep simple, don't want to use a feeder wagon. Proposes to chop the straw through a chopper into a bunker and then add similar brewer's grain to create a mix with a telehandler bucket, and then feed ad libitum feeders. Is this a suitable workable possibility?
Yes, it is. That would certainly work, but I question whether you actually need to be spending the money and time chopping the straw. 20 odd years ago, I was working with a brewery farm in Kent, and there we just used to feed ad lib brewer's grains to beef cattle, for finishing cattle, and they would take straw out of a ring feeder elsewhere in the yard. So I think you could probably do every bit as well, just with ad lib brewer's grains in front of the animals. I presume these are finishing animals we want to push as fast as we can, so so there'll be absolutely no problem in doing that. They would need a small amount of minerals because that diet will be very low in vitamin A, and without the minerals, you do end up with a problem with possibly some blind animals there, which then are very, very difficult to load away when they're fat.
And on the issue of protein, Pete, use of molasses stroke liquid feeds, would you need to add something to the ration for protein?
Not for that particular one with Brewer's Grains. Brewer's Grains is 20% protein, so on that one there would actually be a surplus of protein in that diet. So you could add straight molasses, but that would be a cane-type molasses, a low-protein one would be the benefit. There'd be no point in adding a high-protein molasses product.
Okay. Another one here concerning the transition from growing animals to finishing animals. When should store cattle change from a growing to a finishing ration, and how much would the cereal inclusion increase by with average quality silage as you've talked about today?
Right. The actual weight when they should move on to finishing diet will obviously depend on what the breed of the animals is and what your expected finishing weight is. But in rough terms, I would think for the last 150 kilos of live weight gain, most animals could well be on the finishing diet. And if we achieve a growth rate of the best part of 1.5 kilos over that period, then we're looking at 100 days on the finishing diet. So if we're on just a grass silage diet, an average grass silage from this year, for a growing diet, we might be on 2 kilograms of barley with that to achieve 1 kilogram of live weight gain a day. When we want to push that to the finishing diet, we will probably need to take it up to 5 kilos of barley.
Great, thanks, Pete. Good, concise answers. Jonathan asked the question, could I use rumen-protected fats to boost silage energy to use up last year's stocks of silage?
You could. I wouldn't recommend it. Rumen-protected fats are very expensive. If we use a product like ProFat or Megalac, one of the two standard ones for protected fats, they're going to cost you around about £700 a tonne for 32 megajoules of energy. So for feeding 1 kilogram of that, you could feed 2.5 kilograms of barley for very significantly less. That would cost you, a kilogram of fat would cost you 70 pence. 2.5 kilograms of barley, which would give the same energy, would only cost 25 pence. So yes, the rumen fat would work, but it's a very expensive option and not one I'd recommend. Okay,
hope that helps, Jonathan. And the last question we've currently got at the moment, would you recommend feeding a mixture of grass silage and maize silage to growing cattle this winter, or would it be cheaper to just feed grass silage and cereals? Cost-wise, there wouldn't be very much in it. The reality comes down, it depends what you've got on the farm. If you've got adequate maize silage on the farm, and as I mentioned earlier, maize yields have been very high this year, so if the maize silage is already on the farm, yes, by all means, put the finishing cattle on 50-50 maize and grass silage. But if there isn't enough maize, then barley or oats would be the obvious answer to go with it. I certainly wouldn't buy in maize to go to growing cattle. I'd buy in cereals if that was the choice. Yeah. Pete, so just to go back to that question regarding the oat straw and brewer's grains, what's your view on feeding that to suckler cows as opposed to finishing cattle, spring calving suckler cows? We wouldn't feed it ad lib to suckler cows because they would just eat too much and put on too much weight. But for spring cows, as the questioner was originally suggesting, chopping straw and mixing it with brewer's grains, that would be a perfectly acceptable way. It would be an order of sort of 8 kilograms of chopped straw to 3 kilograms of brewer's grains would be the sort of mix we'd be looking at. Great. Okay, well that dries up the questions we've got so far. Pete, will you stay with us on the line while Debbie does her presentation? Certainly. And if any other questions come in, we've got time at the end, we can come back to you. Thanks. That's great, Pete. As always, succinct, really good value, and I hope delivered at the level that everyone can sort of get value from. So our second speaker today is Debby Brown. She's a trained vet and is currently a consultant looking on veterinary and nutritional issues. Her topic for today is minimising pneumonia in cattle. Debbie.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Chris, for that. Okay, I've basically concentrated on finishing cattle and minimising pneumonia in finishing cattle, but we can widen that a little bit if there's any particular questions. Naturally, calves in a finishing system are under quite a bit of pressure because we're aiming to try and grow them fast for a sharp, cost-effective finish. Now, how much pressure they're under and how many problems we come across can very much depend on what the system's been prior to these calves going into that finishing system. If they're bought in as large stores, they can be bought in from various sources, and this can increase the risk of various pathogens coming in and them meeting pathogens they've never met before. If they've come from a homebred system and it's a homebred finishing unit, then that risk's probably lower and the risks have probably been met sooner in that calf's life, and so we need to think about it in a different way. But the important thing is the control and the management of these animals to try and minimise the problems that we see. We see various causes of pneumonia. These can range from viruses through mycoplasma to bacteria, and one of the biggest influences on these things taking hold and causing problems is actually ammonia. So if we can open up these animals' airflow and open up ventilation within sheds and reduce the amount of ammonia these calves are exposed to right from day one, we'll get a lot less problems all the way through. And we've got to bear that in mind regardless of what else we're trying to do to reduce the problems with pneumonia we see in cattle. Just to sort of give a bit of definition behind it, but the main signs that we see when we get pneumonia problems, which I'm sure most people are aware of, is we'll get increased breathing rate, runny eyes, snotty noses. Coughing's usually the first one. Now sometimes we get coughs where they're not really you don't really see a big problem, and you're not seeing a drop in growth rates. But if that problem persists, then it can affect growth rate, even if we're not seeing really sick animals. And one of the biggest things from that is we'll get a decreased feed intake. And all of these things can lead on to that reduced growth rate and therefore mean that we're more inefficient and we need more feed to actually achieve the finishing targets we're looking for. So the main areas that I would be looking at to try and minimise pneumonia is one, looking at ventilation, one, looking at possible vaccination, depending on the farm, and the other one would be looking at management. And the two main areas that will have probably the biggest impact on reducing the level of disease is by improving ventilation and looking at the stocking densities. Improving ventilation will reduce the build-up of infection within buildings and reduce the risk of spread. If there's less infection there to start with, other animals can't pick it up, which gives us a real benefit and a real good starting point. If we lower the stocking densities in sheds, then again we reduce the spread of infection, and again we're minimising the stress on these animals. We can also then be leading to more feed space being available, which is likely to help better feed intakes and also better growth rates. So we should get an extra bonus, not just on the pneumonia side of things. So you want to really think about where can the air come in and where can the air get out of my sheds. And you need to go and really stand in the middle and think about what the cattle are experiencing. What does it smell like? Can you get that ammonia smell? Does it feel warm and stuffy? Was it colder outside the shed, or is it colder inside the shed? Are there any other buildings that have been put in the way? Because of the way we build sheds in the UK predominantly, we build a shed, and then when we want to expand, we build a shed right next to it, and then we build a shed right next to that. And as soon as we do that, we're reducing the airflow, we're reducing the possibility of air coming into those sheds. The other thing that quite often happens is we'll stack bales in part of the shed, and that will cut off the airflow of the air coming into the shed, and we need to bear that in mind, and we just need to stand there sometimes and take time to look and actually work out what's going on. Once air comes in, it's got to be able to get out, and as animals get bigger, they produce more heat and they'll move the air a little bit quicker. When smaller animals are in a shed, that can be more difficult. So if you've got a mix of ages, you also need to look at which way is the air flowing, and the young calves should be at the fresher end of the shed, because they're going to struggle to move the air more than the bigger animals. Look up to the roof. Are the ridges solid? Because if they're open, or the sheets that are open, sheets on the top of the shed have got slits in them, air's got a chance to escape. And that's going to give a real benefit to helping air movement and help the bugs get out of the building. It's worth always looking at maybe testing with a smoke bomb. These look a bit funny, but they're really useful to know exactly where air is moving within a shed. And is it clearing within 30 to 45 seconds, which would be the absolute optimum. The next thing to look at would be vaccination. If we have got a particular problem on a farm, or we think, or we've done some work and we realise that there are certain viruses that are more of a problem than others, we can look at the possibility of vaccinating. In my opinion, the vaccine would be given as soon as cattle arrive on farm, because they need to be as healthy as they can be, but it also needs to be in there before they experience a lot of the problems. This can be difficult if cattle are coming in from all over the place and are coming in at different ages and sizes. And so a little bit we've got to look at the actual system and work out what's practical. There are various vaccines available, and the appropriate one will be dependent on the system that's in place on the farm. And on the sheet that you'll get afterwards, if you're interested, there's a list of some of the vaccines available and what they cover and where they might be used. In a finishing unit, the most likely virus that's going to be a problem is IBR, and we need to think about the best way to get that in. You can give a live vaccine or you can give an inactivated vaccine. And a lot of the time, inactivated vaccine will be the most beneficial because we can get it in the muscle and it'll give them a boost that'll just get them started. The live vaccine will be the one that we want to get in there. Sorry about that. The live vaccine is the one we want to get in because that's going to get into them quicker and they're going to respond to it quicker. Ideally, when we bring cattle in or as we move cattle through, they'll be put into a group and they'll remain as that set group throughout the system. Every time we change groups, we end up with cattle taking 48 hours to readjust their hierarchy. And then that causes drop in intakes and stress to some of the animals that aren't the most dominant. We've got to consider the health of the animals through the rumen as well as externally with pneumonia and other problems. Because the more power we put into these animals or the more stress we create from these animals, the more likely they are to come down with problems like pneumonia. So the healthier we can keep these animals and the lower we can keep the stress, the better. Keeping bedding dry and clean and looking out every sort of 3 weeks will keep humidity to a minimum and again to reduce the risk of that smell of ammonia. The other thing that's really worth considering is clipping the backs of the animals, because that helps these animals to lose some heat and reduces the sweating. They therefore reduce extra energy loss and improve feed conversion efficiency. So the main factors to look for and to consider are mixing. How can we minimise the amount of mixing that goes on within animals? Can we reduce the amount of movement? So if we've got groups, can they stay in those groups? If they're moving from shed to shed, can we reduce that the amount that they do move from shed to shed and try and decide where animals are going and keep them where they are through the system? We need to make sure we minimise nutrition changes and other issues that might have an impact on them. And we need to try and reduce any other stresses. So make sure there's enough trough space. Look at when we're doing other surgical procedures such as dehorning or if we're castration and try and minimise the risk period for doing those. Don't do them when anything else is happening and always make one change at a time. Just an example really, just to put a lot of these things in place. I did a lot of work on a black and white finishing unit where calves are reared on farm from 2 weeks of age through to finishing. The baby calves are in individual pens, which in those areas we reduce the drafts. We need to stop these calves getting cold, but we need to keep the airflow. So it was a case of reducing drafts but leaving most of the rest of it open. And we didn't have many issues in those calves. But after they'd weaned, they moved into bigger sheds that were all lumped together, just as I explained earlier, where they build one shed next to another. And these calves were then in the same airspace as older bulls, and we started then to see the pneumonia problems. The airflow was poor because we restricted the inflow with other buildings being built next to each other. So we opened all the ridges and we actually increased the space between the boarding on the gable ends just to try and get some air coming in and get some proper air movement through those pens. We minimised the group mixing and movements because one of the things that was going really wrong is if there was an odd animal that wasn't doing quite so well, it would be held back and moved into the next group. And then if that one was carrying something that was going to cause him problem, it would then spread through the others. We then created some isolation pens for these odd animals to go into to try and reduce the spread through the bulk. We looked at vaccinating, and we did some vaccination prior to grouping these animals, and we always made sure that any vaccination that was carried out was done before the animals were grouped and before they were moved, and we were vaccinating against the viruses that we were coming across on farm. We were mucking out every 3 weeks, and we bedded daily, kept the beds as clean and dry as possible. We ensured good clean water access, as well as offering fresh food daily, mixing it to optimise ruminant health as well as performance. We successfully managed to reduce losses from 20% to less than 50%, and reduce treatments from 50% to less than 20%. So not only was it more economic for the farmer for rearing those black and whites, but it was also creating a lot less stress and hassle and made life much more of a pleasure for the farmer. So I think the thing to go home and think about, if you want some main points, is one, what is the biggest bottleneck? What is the biggest thing that's holding your cattle back if you're getting pneumonia? Where is air moving? What are draft symptoms like? And what other stresses do those animals get exposed to through their period on your farm? Thank you.
Excellent, Deb. Thank you. A couple of questions come in. One from Jackie regarding mixed ages. So if you've got cows and calves housed together,
yep.
How do you go about, what would the vaccination program be in the timetable for vaccinating those calves housed with cows?
Is that calves that are suckling the cows? If it's calves suckling the cows, the risk's a little bit less because they'll be exposed to the same bugs, but hopefully the cow's producing some maternal antibody to the calf that the calf will be getting to help them have some protection. If it's cows and calves in the same shed and the calves are not on the cows, in an ideal world, I would be looking at giving some vaccination prior to the calves going into that mixed shed. If it's very young calves going in there, you could consider a intranasal vaccine. One can be given very young. If it's cattle coming in, they've been outside or they've come from a different shed, then you can give one of the multi-vaccinations that covers like all 4 viruses or 3 viruses, and they usually need 2 doses, and ideally I would get those in at least a week prior to them going into the shed with the older cows.
Sorry, Deb, just to go back to those calves that are suckling on the cows,
yeah.
What's your advice there? Nothing, or to vaccinate even though they're suckling?
It depends a little bit on the farm. Majority of farms will get away with not needing to. I do have a couple of farms that have issues with the calves still on there, and we will tend to get the intranasal vaccine into them early in the probably round about sort of 6 weeks of age, and then we follow that up with a multiviral vaccine round about 12 weeks of age.
Okay. Sticking on still to do with pneumonia, is it true that very muscular cattle breeds are more likely to suffer from pneumonia? Thanks for that question.
It's not a particularly true statement as such. We do, I suppose, see a little bit more pneumonia in breeds of that type. Usually it's because they're either more intensively reared or they're under more stress because they're trying to be pushed at faster growth rates. So I don't know if it's particularly to do with the breed, it's more the system that those cattle are under.
Okay. If calves have had pneumonia at a young age, does it reduce their performance later in life?
It does, yes. Once there's some damage in those lungs, it's very, very difficult for that to repair fully. So it will always have some impact on those calves going forward.
And I guess it's difficult to put a value on that depending on the severity of the exposure to the problem they had as a young calf. Yeah,
I mean, usually they talk about sort of adding an extra sort of 2 weeks, 14 days, 10 to 14 days on a finishing time or getting them to the age where you want them and that side of things.
So prevention's better than cure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Would you recommend vaccinating bought-in stores on the day they arrive or leaving them for a few days to recover from the stress of transport before vaccination? I've
tried this both ways on farm. And on most farms, I would suggest getting an attenuated live vaccine in on the day that they arrive, unless any of them are looking not particularly well when they actually arrive. Purely because I tend to find that on most units, if they then leave them for a few days, they then start to see signs of disease, and then it's questionable as to whether they'll respond to the vaccine well enough or not. But it would be one that I would probably advise boosting against. So if they're coming in the stores, I would do them on the day of arrival, but then I would probably give them a boost 4 or 5 weeks later.
Right. What's your view, Deb, on prevalence of pneumonia in finishing animals compared to young stock?
Very dependent on the environment that they're in, but I would say younger animals, it's usually more of a problem than it is in finishing animals. In finishing animals, it's usually a problem if they've had it before.
Okay, I'm just going to read this question as it is. Is there a correlation between cows suffering from Is there a direct correlation between cows suffering from pneumonia and calves born undeveloped? So if a cow is suffering from pneumonia, does that affect the growth of the calf inside her?
The only reason it would, I suspect it probably does, yes. And I think probably the reason behind that would be just because that animal is under stress anyway because it's suffering from a disease. So she will not be targeting her nutrition and her requirements into the fetus. She'll be targeting it to repair of the damage that she's suffering. And
the tricky one maybe for you to answer, what do you think is the most important pneumonia pathogen? And I guess a supplementary to that is, what would your recommendations be for controlling it?
I think it's very dependent on what age of animal we're looking at. So in older animals, I would say probably IBR. In younger animals, it's more likely to be RSV or PI3. But there are other things that are influencing. So one of the things that's coming in that underlies a lot of these other problems is mycoplasma. And that, I think, is becoming a lot more of an issue. It's not as easy to pick up, it's not as easy to vaccinate against, and it's not as easy to treat for. But once it gets in, a lot of the viruses are a lot harder to get on top of, and it certainly reduces growth rates. And then as far as the stress pathogen is concerned, from animals that have been bought in as stores from all over the place, then Pasteurelle's got to be considered for those as well. As far as managing those different problems, it very much depends on where I'm seeing it, at what time, in the calf's growth period or life cycle, and what else is going on farm. For viruses, I would definitely look at vaccinating at the right time. In the herd where mycoplasma is a particular issue, I would look at trying to look down the vaccination route for that as well, although antibiotics can help, but they have to be quite strategic. And more than anything, I would seriously look at the environment and the management and try and minimise the impact that they're having on these animals to start with.
So just to summarise then, would you recommend that and if so, how, the farmers understand the precise strains that they're trying to tackle, or is it...
A little bit, I would go off sort of clinical signs and the type of animal that we're looking at. But quite often it might be worth testing. I would if we're not sure what's going on farm, then I would get some blood tests and actually see exactly what strains we're picking up and what we're seeing on farm.
Okay. Last one for you, Deb, and we'll give you a break. Are you seeing much mycoplasma at the moment?
It's increasing. I'm definitely seeing more and more. I'm seeing more and more herds with it.
Okay. Pete, you still with us?
Yes, I am. Yep.
A couple of questions that people are coming with for you. Limestone flour. Can you just explain a bit more about this? I understand that it reduces acidity, but the person asking the question missed the rate at which to feed it. Limestone flour.
Right. Yeah, okay. Limestone flour, it's literally ground up rock, but it's basically calcium carbonate, so it's a neutralizing effect. The application rate would be around about 100 grams per head per day for finishing cattle. And if you've got younger cattle on a particularly acidic silage, then it would be 50 grams a head for anything less than 300 kilos.
Okay.
It's cost around about £80 to £100 a tonne. Bicarb would be the other alternative, but that's around £330 a tonne, and not as strong a neutralising value as limestone.
Okay, we've got a question from an organic producer who produces no cereals on site, so there's an issue of sourcing organic cereals. They have suckler cows and they're finishing as well. Do you have any pointers, Pete? It's a bit of an open question, but do you have any pointers on the best type and quality of components to have in a concentrate mix, bearing in mind they've got to be brought into an organic system?
Right. Being an organic system, there's a fair chance that the protein level in their silage is quite good because of the clover content that they've probably got in their swards. That being the case, certainly for finishing cattle, all they would need would be straight cereals. So even though they're buying it in, they can normally buy in... you can certainly buy in ground organic maize. Rolled organic maize is available from the trade. We use that some of our dairy farms. That's around about £260 a tonne. Wheat would be available to buy from the blenders at around about £250 a tonne as well, rolled wheat. So I would still concentrate very much on the cereals. Organic is no different to non-organic on that basis.
Okay, just back onto the additives. So we've had a question about yeast. Is it good to feed yeast in a finishing ration?
No. I don't like feeding any of these sort of fairy dust type products. The yeast can have an effect. It can mop up some acidity in the ration and have effects on feed intakes. But for every trial you do where you get a response, you'll do 3 or 4 where you don't get a response. And it's quite expensive to feed. It's going to be costing 3 or 4 pence an animal per day to feed it, whereas the limestone would cost under a penny a day to feed and would do a better job of neutralising the acid or a more reliable job of neutralising the acid than yeast would.
I had a question from a producer who fed haylage only last year and noticed an increase in birth weights. Would you suggest feeding that this winter, as they've had a good growing year with quality forage produced? Yeah,
I mean, certainly for suckers, if you've got good quality haylage, that will give you perfectly adequate birth weights, and keep condition on the cows quite well as well. I mean, haylage is only basically dry silage, and a lot of haylage would probably be made as second cut or even third cut. And then it comes down to the growing period for the grass. If it's 6 weeks since it was last grazed or last cut, that haylage could still be 11 ME. Just because it's haylage doesn't mean it's low energy.
So recommend get it analysed, and then you know what you're feeding, basically?
Yeah. It could be anywhere between the 9 ME and the 11.5 ME for haylage, just the same as it could be for clamp silage.
Good. Okay, well, that's our 45 minutes up. That brings us nicely back to where we started in terms of analysing silage. So on behalf of all of our callers, I've been monitoring the numbers. We've had up to 50 people on the call at once, so thank you for you all calling in. Big thanks to our speakers for being very informative and on time and answering the questions succinctly. For those, we've mentioned the expert sheets, the notes that Pete and Debbie have produced. You can request those at our email address, which is brpconf, C-O-N-F, at eblex.ahdb.org.uk. So request a fact sheet at brpconf. If you've already requested the reminder that we sent out, you're already on the database and you'll receive those automatically. If you want to have a reminder or an alarm, it's not really an alarm, it's an email to notify you of the next conference, which is on Friday the 7th of November at 1:30 p.m. Friday the 7th of November at 1:30 p.m. You can request an email reminder, again, by emailing to brpconf@eblex.ahdb.org.uk. Information on the next teleconference call will be sent out to you. What we'll try and do is send you reminders on the Fridays before the events coming up, so 2 weeks out, 1 week out, and then on the day itself, hoping not to overflow your inbox, but to keep you informed of what's going on. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon for this first call. If you've got any feedback, we would welcome that. It's a new idea, but we hope we've been able to bring some experts into your office or your front room or your kitchen or your farm vehicle this afternoon without asking you to travel too far or put yourselves out. So thank you very much and good afternoon. Thank you.